"This isn't for you. You'd better leave now." A technician barked straight into his face, shoulder checking him hard enough that the old tool bag fell onto the cold concrete floor. In the hangar, a few dry, short laughs broke out. Someone said loudly, not even bothering to lower his voice, "What? We called the museum to fix an Apache." At that moment, the AH-64 still lay motionless. The engine was silent. Outside, the dam was cracking in chunks. People were still trapped, and if the Apache couldn't fly, they would truly die. But only a few seconds later, just a very brief moment, when he bent down and placed his hand on the freezing metal skin of the aircraft, the entire room fell silent, not out of respect, but because the words he spoke made everyone's spine turn cold. "It's not broken. It's being covered." The man they had just mocked was no failure. He had been one of the first-generation Apache pilots, a survivor of missions the system called impossible. A veteran was erased from the records because he dared to fly when procedure said no. And today, he was the last choice between life and a disaster. If you were him, what would you do? Stay silent to protect yourself, or stand up against an entire system hiding its own mistakes? If you want to know who was right, who was wrong, and what the real cost of silence is, watch until the end. Subscribe to the channel now, and comment, would you choose to stand up or stay silent? At the end of the year, when most mountain routes in the American West had already grown used to ice, snow, and bitter winds, this storm arrived in a way that rendered every prediction meaningless. It wasn't dry snow, it was cold, heavy rain mixed with mud and rock sliding down the mountainsides in waves that didn't stop. After a single night, the narrow access roads into the valley were ripped apart, swallowed under a thick layer of slurry. The residential areas deep below no longer had stable communication. Signals came and went, like the fading breath of a body being buried alive. Upstream, the small dam built only to regulate seasonal rains had begun showing new cracks. They weren't large or dramatic, just thin lines of seepage creeping down the gray concrete, but enough for anyone with experience to know this was no longer a routine engineering issue. Water leaked out drop by drop, then in thin streams carrying fine silt, a clear sign that the pressure behind the structure had surpassed its safety threshold. Below the dam, people were still trapped, not a large group, but enough that if the dam failed, they wouldn't have time to understand what was happening. Wind slammed against the temporary shelters the rescue crews had set up along the mountainside. The tarp overhead thrashed as if it might be torn from its steel frame. A rescuer held his radio tightly, speaking quickly to overpower the wind. "The dam's leaking harder. We can hear the concrete cracking." His voice didn't shake, but his breathing did. On the other end, the duty officer noted it down, his hand pausing on the keyboard for a beat too long. Inside the makeshift command tent, the water level indicators on the control panel blinked non-stop. The weather officer leaned close to the screen, compared the newest data, then looked up. "If the temperature drops any further, the pressure will kill this dam before sunrise." He delivered the statement like a conclusion already signed off on. Everyone understood that when water partially freezes and then thaws quickly, the internal expansion inside an old structure rises in ways impossible to control. A ground team tried to skirt along the eastern ridge to descend into the valley. Less than an hour later, the radio crackled with panic. Mud and rock just swallowed the second truck. "There's no road left." Behind the voice came the sound of metal grinding and people shouting. The channel glitched with static, then went dead. On the map, the route was crossed out in red, a clean, merciless slash. The last reconnaissance drone was launched in winds far above safe limits. The footage it sent back was patchy, showing only a dense white veil of mist, occasionally revealing the dam's crest and the churning brown water below. Its microphone picked up nothing but constant wind, no voices, no new guidance. Seconds later, the feed cut out completely. The drone vanished from the screen as if it had never existed. On the large table in the command tent, the regional map was spread open, layers of data stacked on top of each other. The residential zone beneath the dam was circled in thick red. A lieutenant pointed at it and read out the simulation results. "If it breaks, they have 4 minutes. Why then they're all gone." No one disputed the number. Everyone around the table had seen flash floods before and knew that 4 minutes in a torrent of mud and debris was barely enough time to run, let alone survive. A young officer gripped his headset and turned to Colonel David Reynolds, who was standing with one hand on the map table. "We're losing control by the hour. "We need someone in the air." Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the timelines and the access routes already crossed out, then stopped at the icon marking the only helicopter not marked in red. The updated weather report was placed directly in front of Reynolds. The messenger tapped the file lightly to draw attention. "Nothing can fly except the Apache, but it's never done rescue work." The statement hung in the air. The AH-64 Apache was built for war, for firepower and speed, not for slow, low-altitude flight in narrow valleys, packed with wind shear, but it was the only aircraft still capable of handling the wind and terrain under the current conditions. Reynolds looked at his watch. The second hand moved in steady, indifferent ticks, completely out of sync with the compressed, suffocating sense of time inside the tent. Outside, rain kept pounding, mud kept sliding down in small collapses. Every new update from the field was shorter, sharper. No one spoke about the ideal plan anymore, only about the plan that could happen before it was too late. The radio suddenly blared, the static louder than usual. The voice on the other end was broken, as if shouting to pierce through wind and distance. Someone just fell into a fissure. "We lost one." The final word was swallowed by noise. The command tent went silent. No one asked for a repeat. No one asked for details. Everyone knew the number on the map had just gone up by 1. Irreversible. Reynolds placed his hand on the table, his fingers trembling slightly, whether from cold or something else. Outside, the wind howled harder, like a reminder that the storm wasn't waiting for anyone's decisions. For a few brief seconds, every eye turned to him, waiting for the next order. And somewhere beneath the leaking dam, the people still trapped had no idea that their lives were being measured in breaths. The AH-64 Apache was pulled out of the hangar under the pale yellow lights of the temporary runway. The wind was still whipping hard, driving cold rain and fine mud against the aircraft's fuselage, leaving dark blotches over the already worn military paint. Everyone present knew this wasn't the ideal moment to bring a combat helicopter into operation, but they also understood something more important. This was the only moment left. Behind them, every road leading into the valley had been erased from the real map. In front of them was the only Apache still capable of handling strong winds and tight spaces. A technician leaned low over the control panel, gripping the ignition key. Wind swept through, forcing his voice to strain just to be heard. "Ready. Ignition." The sound echoed through the headsets of everyone standing nearby, a familiar signal from hundreds of previous sorties. But this time, it wasn't followed by the usual roar of the engine. The main rotor shuddered, turned half a revolution, then stopped. A heavy silence fell over the runway. No one spoke right away. A few people tilted their heads, as if waiting for a delayed sound to arrive. But nothing happened. The wind kept blowing, the rain kept falling, and the Apache stayed motionless, like a piece of metal forgotten in the storm. Another technician stared at the control screen, then barked. Unable to hide his frustration, "It says nothing. No errors, no response." The data lines appeared within acceptable limits. No red warnings, no overload signals, no signs the engine was suffering a major failure. To veteran mechanics, that silence was more frightening than a flashing wall of errors. The engine lead stepped back, pulled off his gloves, and threw them hard onto the wet concrete. "All parameters are clean to the point of being fake." He spoke without looking at anyone, his eyes fixed on the aircraft. In his mind, the worst-case scenarios were already forming. A system that looks too perfect is rarely a good sign, especially on an Apache that had spent years operating under harsh conditions. Technicians spread out around the helicopter, opening panels and checking the easiest points of access. Their hands moved by muscle memory, but their eyes kept darting toward the control panel, waiting for any change at all. The tension in the air thickened. Time was no longer abstract. It existed in every raindrop hitting their watches, in every stronger gust that signaled worsening weather. Colonel David Reynolds stepped out of the command tent, his coat soaked from the rain. He stopped a few meters from the aircraft, surveying the scene for several seconds before speaking. His voice was hoarse from exhaustion and from hours of shouting over radios throughout the long night. How long to find the cause? The question sounded simple, but everyone knew it carried a weight far greater than that. Not how long in theory, how long before the upstream dam passed the point of no return. A technician looked up, rainwater running along the edge of his helmet. "Not a matter of minutes. Something's being hidden." He spoke slowly, choosing his words, It wasn't an official conclusion, just the instinct of someone who had spent too many years reading data and listening to machines, but that instinct was enough to make Reynolds pause for a beat longer. A dry, sharp sound came from the compressor section, not loud, but enough to startle everyone. A puff of white vapor shot out and vanished quickly in the wind, leaving a faint metallic smell in the air. Several people stepped back on reflex. One technician raised his hand, signaling all activity to stop. The Apache remained still, but that moment was enough to remind them that beneath the metal skin was a complex system that could turn dangerous at any moment. Reynolds watched, his jaw tightening. He turned back toward the command tent, where maps and screens were constantly updating with field data. He knew that every minute spent here was another minute. The people trapped below the dam were forced to wait in dread, but he also knew that sending an unstable Apache into the air could create another disaster. This time, right in front of him, on the runway, the technical crew continued exchanging short remarks, their voices low so they wouldn't get lost in the wind. They rechecked fuel supply, electrical connections, and primary sensors. Everything was by the book, within spec. Frustration showed on every face. No one wanted to say aloud what they were all thinking, that they might be facing a problem that didn't appear in any checklist. Reynolds's radio crackled abruptly, the static drowning out the first words. He lifted it to his ear, straining to listen. If the Apache doesn't take off in 2 hours, the voice broke with the wind and a weak signal. We won't have anyone left to hold on ride. The transmission ended in a brief, empty pause, just long enough for Reynolds to grasp that the situation below the dam had worsened. He lowered the radio and looked again at the motionless Apache. The runway lights flickered over its fuselage, creating uneven patches of light and shadow, like an irregular heartbeat. The technicians awaited his glance, waiting for the next decision, though they knew none of the options would make things easier. The wind struck harder again, rattling the idle rotor blades. In that moment, Reynolds realized they were standing between two parallel timelines. One belonged to regulations, to inspection, to certainty, to absolute safety. The other belonged to the people trapped beneath the dam, where every passing minute could be the last. And the Apache, still silent before them, sat exactly on the line between those two worlds. No one spoke further. No one proposed a new approach. Everyone waited, as if the engine's silence had spread to the people around it. The radio remained open, ready to deliver more news no one wanted to hear. And somewhere in the wind and rain, the 2-hour countdown had already begun most mercilessly. The temporary command room was set up right beside the runway, its lightweight walls shaking with every gust. Fluorescent lights shone down on the long table in the center, where the valley map and the dam occupied almost the entire surface. Red dots blinked non-stop, each flash tied to a new update from the field. The air was thick with the damp smell of wet jackets and the fatigue of too many sleepless hours. Mark Ellison spoke first. He set the thick file on the table, the sound of paper hitting wood sharp and dry. Without my signature, this aircraft doesn't get anywhere near the sky. His voice was slow, steady, not loud, but firm enough to make every side conversation stop. Ellison didn't look around. His eyes stayed fixed on the file as if the numbers and signatures inside were the only things he needed to address. An officer across the table, unable to hold back his frustration, slammed his hand down, sending a few pens rolling. Procedure won't save anyone sinking in the mud. The words burst out faster than he thought them, carrying the helplessness of someone who had heard too many bad reports through the night. A few people nodded, others turned away, as if the comment had touched the thought they were trying not to think. Ellison lifted his gaze, this time locking his eyes on Colonel David Reynolds. My signature means I take responsibility if it blows up in the air. He enunciated each word, not to argue, but to remind everyone that his signature wasn't a formality. It was the line between a collective decision and a personal responsibility that couldn't be divided. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He leaned against the table, studying the map in front of him. The dam section blinked red without pause, water level numbers updating by the minute. A lieutenant near the screen clenched his jaw, his voice low and tense. That's not a warning. That's a sentence. No one contradicted him. The comment hung in the room like a truth everyone already accepted. Ellison opened the file and flipped quickly through a few maintenance reports. The printed lines were neat, the numbers perfectly aligned, everything tidy to the point of suspicion. He stopped on a page, placing his finger on a small entry. There's a mismatch here. Someone either wrote this wrong or hid the error. His voice lowered, as if speaking louder would crack the thin order he was clinging to. Another officer, younger, shook his head. We don't have time to find who messed up the paperwork. He spoke quickly, glancing at Reynolds, then back at Ellison. People out there are waiting. Ellison closed the file, resting his hand on the pen in front of him. His fingers tightened until the knuckles turned white. I won't sign until I know why the engine is silent. The words weren't defiant, just a statement that left no room for retreat. To Ellison, a silent engine was more dangerous than any warning light. It meant something had slipped outside their control. For the next few seconds, only the wind outside and the steady hum of the ventilation filled the room. Reynolds looked from person to person, combat officers, technicians pressed against the walls. He saw the divide forming, not between individuals, but between two ideas of responsibility. One was responsible for the people trapped below the dam. The other was the responsibility of whoever climbed into the Apache if it took off. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice low and rough. If we wait for every answer, there may be no one left to save. He said it more like a reminder to himself than an attempt to persuade Ellison. His eyes lingered on the map for one more beat, then returned to the engineer. But if we push an unstable aircraft into the air, we may lose more people. Ellison nodded slightly, as if agreeing with both halves of the statement. That's exactly why I won't sign. If something happens, everyone will ask why I signed when I saw these signs. A short beep from the radio on the table cut into the tension, signaling a new update. An officer leaned down to listen, then lifted his head with a tighter expression. Water pressure is rising faster than predicted. The team at the dam reports another crack. The report was brief, with no added commentary, but enough to slow the breathing in the room. Reynolds pressed a hand to his forehead, rubbing hard as if to push back the headache coming on. He looked at Ellison again. If you were me, what would you do? There was no authority in the question, only the search for something, though Reynolds knew he wouldn't get an easy answer. Ellison stayed silent for a few seconds. When he spoke, his tone kept its usual slow rhythm. I'd find someone who understands this Apache differently, not through reports. His eyes flicked briefly toward the room's doorway, then back. Some problems aren't in the manuals. The comment made several people exchange glances. Reynolds realized Ellison was hinting at something he himself had already considered, but hadn't wanted to name, an option outside the official system, carrying risks no less serious than sending the Apache up right now. Reynolds straightened. He pushed the chair aside and walked around the table, each step slow and heavy. When he stopped, he wasn't looking at the map anymore, but directly at Ellison and the others. We need another perspective, he said, and we don't have much time. No one asked what he meant. No one requested clarification. Some moments make an entire room understand without explanation that the next decision won't appear in any official record. Reynolds reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his personal phone. The screen lit up under the fluorescent lights, reflecting across his face. He turned away from the table, taking a few steps toward the corner, where the wind outside could be heard more clearly. His finger moved quickly over the screen, choosing a number no one else recognized. When he lifted the phone to his ear, the room behind him fell completely silent, as if everyone were waiting for the person on the other end to pick up. Reynolds's call didn't last long. He didn't explain the situation, didn't mention the dam or the Apache sitting dead outside. Just one short sentence, enough for the person on the other end to understand how serious it was. I need you. One last time. Then, a few seconds of silence, followed by a faint sigh, almost inaudible through the weak signal. Reynolds didn't wait for a promise. He hung up before hearing a full reply, as if both of them knew some words didn't need to be spoken. Nearly an hour later, an old pickup truck stopped in front of the hangar. Wind slammed against the vehicle, making the door shake before it swung open. Thomas Keller stepped out, holding a worn-out tool bag, its fabric faded from years of grease and weather. He paused for a beat, taking in the base running at full tension. Lights, machinery, people rushing past. No one greeted him, and no one stopped him. When Keller entered the hangar, several heads turned immediately. A cuckoo rose from a corner. We're calling the museum now, a technician said loudly, as if to make sure Keller heard. He didn't turn, nor change his pace. The tool bag hit the concrete floor with a dry thud. A young mechanic nearby leaned toward a coworker, whispering low but still loud enough to spread in the enclosed space. That's him, the one who flew against orders back then. The comment carried both curiosity and caution. The older crew didn't react, but the tension in their faces showed the memory was still intact. Keller crouched beside the Apache and placed his hand on its fuselage. The metal was cold under his fingertips, nothing like the familiar feel from years past. He stayed still for a few seconds, as if listening for a faint breath. Around him, others watched with skeptical eyes. To them, the gesture looked like an odd habit from someone who'd been away from real work for too long. Mark Ellison appeared at the hangar entrance, arms crossed. His gaze never left Keller. "Do whatever you want," Ellison said, his tone neutral. "But I'm not signing." It wasn't a challenge. It was a boundary. Ellison wanted it clear from the start that Keller's presence didn't change his legal responsibility. Keller didn't respond right away. He opened the tool bag and pulled out a few old basics, each marked by years of use. He leaned closer to the engine, his eyes tracing parts the others had already checked. "It's talking," Keller said, his voice low and slow, as if speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "You boys just aren't listening." A technician nearby laughed outright. "Helicopters don't whisper, old man." A few more chuckles followed. No one expected Keller to answer. They were used to veterans bringing old stories and outdated instincts, things that no longer belonged in the current system. Keller lifted his head. His eyes passed over each face, pausing longest on Ellison and then Reynolds, who had just walked into the hangar. "It whispers when someone's been hiding something." His voice wasn't loud or sharp, but clear enough to cut through the scattered laughter. A few people fell silent not because they believed him, but because of the certainty in his tone. Reynolds stood a few steps away from Keller, watching quietly. He remembered Keller's file-well-dry lines, describing an old disciplinary decision. A skilled pilot technician who refused to follow safety recommendations on a mission the system had deemed too risky. In the end, one group was saved, and another crew didn't return. The report concluded Keller wasn't technically wrong, but also not acceptable in a system built on rigid procedure. Keller turned back to the Apache and resumed checking it in his own way. He didn't ask who had done what earlier, didn't request the paperwork. He touched each component, listened to the sound of metal when he tapped lightly, and felt the vibration as he rotated a few parts by hand. To the people watching, his method was both strange and unsettling. It didn't appear in any maintenance manual. Ellison stepped closer, keeping enough distance to observe without interfering. "What exactly are you trying to find?" he asked, his tone controlled but already carrying a hint of tension. "We checked everything by the book." Keller didn't look up. "I'm not looking for an error," he said. "I'm looking for what doesn't fit." He stopped at a point, placing his finger on a component the report said had been recently replaced. "This shouldn't be here like this." Another technician came over, frowning. "That part was replaced on schedule," he said quickly. "Paperwork's clean." Keller nodded slightly. "Paperwork says it's right. The metal doesn't." He straightened and turned toward Reynolds, who signed the last maintenance shift. The question hung in the air. Ellison didn't answer immediately. A flicker crossed his expression before the usual firmness returned. "That has nothing to do with whether it can fly," he said. "And even if it did, I still won't sign off on anything outside the manual." Reynolds raised a hand, signaling everyone to stay quiet. He looked at Keller, then at the Apache. "Are you sure you're hearing something wrong?" Reynolds asked, not challenging him, but weighing the last step before going further. Keller met his eyes. "I'm sure," he said, "and if I'm wrong, you can send me out of here immediately." His voice carried no bravado, just the calm acceptance of someone who'd lived with risk long enough. The hangar went silent. The earlier jokes were gone. In their place was a tight stillness. Reynolds knew that a single nod allowing Keller to continue meant crossing an unofficial line, but if he didn't, they would stay trapped in the same reports and procedures that had led nowhere. He checked his watch, then looked outside where rain still hammered the runway. Time wasn't on their side. He turned back and nodded slowly. "Do it your way," he said, "but everything happens where I can see it." Keller dipped his head not in thanks, but like a habit before starting serious work. He returned to the engine and opened the tool bag again. Those around him stepped back, forming a loose circle to watch. No one said another word. In that space, only the wind, the rain, and the faint metallic sounds of Keller's tools could be heard, like the Apache was finally preparing to tell a story it had been forced to keep hidden. Keller worked neither fast nor slow. He moved around the Apache as if he had belonged to this space for years, even though it had been a long time since he'd stepped inside an active hangar. Every step had a purpose. No waste, no haste. Those watching realized something unsettling. Keller wasn't seeking consensus. He was simply doing what he believed needed to be done. He stopped at a valve assembly on the engine's side listed in the report as recently replaced. Keller crouched, stared at it for a long moment, then looked up. "Take this off," he said it short, like an order. Mark Ellison reacted almost instantly. That unit passed inspection. He took a step forward, his voice tightening. Touch it, and you take the responsibility. To Ellison, that request wasn't just outside the manual, it was stepping straight across the legal line he'd been guarding. Keller didn't turn his head. Paperwork doesn't save people drowning, he replied flatly. It wasn't an argument, it was a conclusion shaped by too many times watching the cost of following the rules on paper instead of the reality in front of them. A young technician glanced at Ellison, then back at Keller. He hesitated, one hand still resting on the tool set. Reynolds stood a few meters away, watching both of them. He didn't intervene yet. He wanted to see how far Ellison would go when pushed to the edge. Ellison drew a slow breath. You know if you're wrong, the fallout won't stop here. His voice was lower now, not just for you. Keller finally turned to look at him. I know, he said, but if we don't do it, the fallout won't stop here either. His eyes moved from Ellison to Reynolds, then to the Apache. The difference is you still have a choice this time. Reynolds gave a slight nod. Not an official authorization, but enough for the technician to understand he could proceed. The tool dropped onto the first bolt. Metal hitting metal echoed sharply inside the hangar. Keller watched every movement. When the final bolt came loose, a different sound slipped out, not loud, but enough to make Keller pause. He tilted his head, listened, then gave a small nod. There it is. A technician stepped back instinctively. If you're wrong, you'll damage the whole compressor section, he said, unable to hide his worry. Everyone else tensed. They knew the compressor was a place where tolerance didn't exist. One small misalignment could trigger a dangerous chain reaction. Keller didn't answer. He lifted the valve assembly out and set it carefully on a metal table. Under the overhead lights, the piece revealed faint scratches and a slight misalignment almost invisible unless you knew where to look. This hasn't been aligned since the last maintenance cycle, Keller said evenly. Not yesterday, a long time. Ellison stepped closer, bending to inspect it. His expression shifted quickly from skepticism to sharp concentration. He rotated the part, checking the contact points. The more he looked, the stiffer his face became. Who signed this maintenance shift? Ellison asked, his voice low but cutting. No one replied. A few technicians looked at the floor. Others turned away. Reynolds realized the silence wasn't from ignorance but from knowing too well. Ellison's question hung in the air, heavier than the wind hammering the hangar walls. The wind strengthened, rattling the Apache's motionless rotors. Metal clinked faintly across the hangar, a reminder that time was moving whether they were ready or not. Outside, the dam wasn't waiting for them to resolve internal issues. Ellison set the assembly down, straightened up. This isn't in any of the reports, he said. If we keep going, everything moves out of control. He turned to Reynolds. Colonel, I can't sign off on any further steps. Reynolds looked at Keller. Your thoughts? He asked, voice low. For the first time, he asked directly, an acknowledgement that Keller had stepped into a role the system no longer handled. Keller wiped his hands on an old cloth, eyes still on the engine. I think we're looking at the cause, he said. Not all of it, but enough to explain its silence. He turned to Ellison. If you're worried about your signature, I don't need you to sign the next step. Ellison frowned. And what step is that? Keller looked him straight in the eye. Fire it up again. He said it slowly, clearly. The words made several people around them stiffen. They had just seen a misaligned component, and now Keller wanted to crank the engine again. A technician shook his head. That's extremely dangerous, he said. If it reacts wrong, we won't stop it in time. Keller nodded. I know, he said, but if we don't try, you won't know how it behaves when it's finally freed from this choke point. He pointed at the spot where the part had been. Some things only reveal themselves when the machine starts speaking the truth. Ellison stepped forward, tension rising in his voice. You're asking us to put the entire hangar at risk. Keller didn't flinch. I'm asking you to face the risk that already exists, he said. It's been there for a long time. You just chose not to see it. Reynolds stood still, absorbing every word. He looked toward the incident map on the table in the corner, the water levels rising by the minute. He turned back to Keller. If we try it and something goes wrong, Keller didn't hesitate. I take responsibility, he said. That's why I'm here. Ellison looked at Keller, then at Reynolds. He realized this wasn't a technical argument anymore. It was about responsibility and choosing which failure they could live with. At last, Ellison stepped back half a pace. I'll record that I do not sign, he said, and I object. Keller nodded. You have that right, he said, and I respect it. The hangar fell silent again. Wind howled. Rain hammered the metal roof in steady, merciless beats, like an invisible clock. Every gaze turned toward Keller, waiting for the final confirmation, even though they knew he'd already made the choice. Keller set his hand on the Apache's fuselage once more, feeling the faintest vibration of the metal in the wind. He turned back to the group. His voice was quiet, but unwavering. "Start it again," he said. "If I'm wrong, you can throw me out of here on the spot." The hangar now felt like an airlocked room, white light falling over the cold metal surfaces and the scorched, hard sheen of the Apache. Wind outside still slipped through the steel seams, just enough to make the roof vibrate faintly. No one on the technical team dared leave their positions while Keller stood at the auxiliary control panel. Every movement he made drew eyes with it, as though he were the only one still able to hear a signal the entire system refused to return. Reynolds stood slightly behind, one hand resting on his belt, shoulders leaning forward. No one spoke, because any word now could knock Keller's focus, even a fraction off course. Mark Ellison stood at the precise safety distance, notebook still open from the previous inspection. He set his pen on the edge of the Apache but hadn't written anything. The silence was so taut that a falling pen could have startled the entire room. Keller checked every switch, fingers gliding over each point as though he were scanning his own memory. He drew a long enough breath to clear his thoughts, then looked at the technician standing by the ignition button. The technician swallowed, nodded, and placed his finger on the switch. In that moment, everything slowed as if stretched into one long frame. Then the button was pressed. The engine reacted instantly, but not like any startup the technical crew had ever witnessed. The RPM shot upward so fast the gauge trembled, then plunged as if strangled. The sound from the engine bay skipped a beat, shifting into a strange tone that made even the most seasoned techs shiver. It wasn't the sound of catastrophic failure, nor the groan of a machine low on oil. It was like a heartbeat slipping off rhythm in the middle of fear, dangerous, almost imperceptible, unless you were tuned to it. Temperature spiked suddenly, rapidly, uncontrollably. The needle crossed the yellow zone, entered red, then froze. No shake, no drift. That stillness made the entire team hold their breath. They were familiar with overheating, but a needle locking into place as if seized was something no one wanted to see. It signaled a deeper malfunction than anything surface level, a flaw buried inside the engine's rhythm, not in its readable parameters. Keller stood close to the console, his face tightening with every subtle change on the screen. He tilted his head, listening to the machine, as though listening to someone trying to speak through desperation. Fragments of sound passed through the metal shell, not loud, but enough for him to recognize the wrongness. Then he said, "Shut it down, now." The command landed cleanly, not rushed, but sharp enough to trigger immediate action. The kill switch was pressed. The engine jerked once, then the RPM dropped so fast that several people stepped back on reflex. Then, everything fell into complete stillness. The smell of hot metal spread, the kind of smell that could make one think of an ignition risk. But Keller knew it wasn't fire. It was the scent of an engine forced beyond its limit in too short a span, like the last strained breath of an athlete whose heart has missed a beat. The technician at the load monitoring station leaned over the displays, then murmured low enough that no one had to hear it loudly, "It won't take load. This isn't a quick fix failure." Another nodded, trying to keep his expression steady, though his hands were still clenched out of instinct. Only now did Ellison lower his eyes to his notebook. He wrote one line, "Unsafe condition confirmed." The pen stroke was smooth, not shaky, but when he looked up, his expression had clearly shifted, not satisfied with being right, not relief. It was the look of someone realizing a much larger problem was rising from the depths of a lake he'd mistaken for calm. Reynolds stepped forward, taking a few slow, heavy paces, staring directly at the engine that had just gone dark. He said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. Everyone knew the situation was pushing beyond a simple mechanical error. With each check, each test, each bad metric, they were being forced closer to a truth none of them wanted to face. Keller remained still beside the Apache's starboard side. He looked at the engine for a long time, not with the disappointment of someone whose machine refused to run, but with the gaze of a man searching for the precise seam where the truth had slipped inside. He rested his palm on the metal shell, still warm. Those watching could see how he listened to the machine, as though trying to catch a surviving heartbeat. Keller had heard an Apache, even when its instruments said nothing. And in this minute, everyone understood he was hearing something they with all their sensors had not caught. A young technician glanced at Ellison, then at Reynolds, but neither showed any intention of interrupting Keller. No one wanted to break the thread he was tracing. In their minds, it felt as though they were all balanced across a thin edge. Only Keller could see the path beyond. The air thickened with each passing second. No one moved abruptly, as if any sudden motion could tilt the situation into something worse. Keller removed his hand from the engine, studying the narrow seams where sheets of metal met, then stepped back half a foot. The overhead light carved deeper lines of fatigue across his face. Fatigue carried from too many years spent away from a hangar like this. A long, bottomless silence stretched out. Then Keller spoke, voice low, measured, each word dropping like the final point of an unfinished conclusion. It's not done talking, but time is about to. The hangar froze exactly as it was. No cough, no shifting feet, no follow-up question, only a moment suspended between gusts outside, and Keller's words sealed the entire first test in a cold, unyielding mark. The pressure didn't come from the command room first. It came from the radio. The sound burst through suddenly, overpowering even the wind hammering against the hangar's metal roof. The static was thick, but the voice on the other end was still clear enough that no one in the room could pretend they didn't hear it. Water's over the edge. This isn't a forecast anymore. The sentence was torn apart by wind and water, but its meaning needed no further explanation. Reynolds froze for a very brief beat. He turned toward the central control panel, where the water level graph was displayed. The line that had been climbing slowly now shot upward like a wall. A duty officer leaning over the data spoke quietly to Reynolds, as if raising his voice would somehow make things worse. We're watching failure in real time. No one contradicted him. No one asked for confirmation. The numbers jumping across the screen carried enough weight to crush any remaining hope that they still had time. The room grew heavier not from lack of air, but because everyone was doing the math on how many minutes were left before all choices closed. The radio burst again. This time, a different voice, broken and lower. Infantry team pulling back. We lost another one. The message ended with a long gap, as if the speaker needed a few seconds to swallow what came after. Bad news arrived without details now, but no one needed them to know the cost of pushing forward in these conditions. Mark Ellison stood by the table, one hand on his notebook. He didn't look at the screen or the radio. He looked at Reynolds. I'm not signing, Ellison said, his voice steady but firm, not even with 1 minute left. He set the notebook on the table, its cover hitting the wood with a clarity that cut through the spreading silence. A lieutenant near the door couldn't contain himself. He slammed a hand against the metal wall. The sound cracked through the room. You're signing people's death warrants out there. The words shot out, almost uncontrolled, carrying the fury of someone watching every second get crushed by procedure. Ellison turned to him, no anger, no rebuttal. I'm refusing to sign a machine that could kill more people, he replied, in the air or on the ground. He spoke slowly, as if each word had to carry its own weight. The tension in the room tightened to the point where one more sentence could have blown everything apart. Reynolds raised a hand to quiet them, but even he felt the internal shake. He'd stood in this position long enough to know some moments had no right decision, only different forms of wrong. Thomas Keller stood near the hangar door, listening to the entire exchange. He didn't interrupt. He let those still inside the system speak first. When he finally turned back, his voice dropped, different from his earlier calm. If we don't try again, Keller said, we won't need signatures anymore. Several people snapped their heads toward him, not because he raised his voice, but because it was the first time he stripped the situation of any middle ground. Reynolds looked at Keller, his expression darkening. You understand what you're saying? Keller nodded. I understand perfectly, he said. If we stop here, the people below that dam have no options left, and then none of the signatures on this table will mean anything. Ellison's jaw tightened. You're asking us to ignore every safety barrier. Keller shook his head slightly. No, he said. I'm saying the real barrier was broken long before this. We're just standing here watching it collapse. The radio came alive again. This time, it wasn't a technical report, it was a human sound. A child's cry filtered through the rescue channel, mixed with wind and water. It didn't last long, but it froze the room. Reynolds felt his throat dry out. He didn't need to know where that child was or whether someone was still holding them. The sound alone tore through every layer of distance he had tried to keep. Reynolds turned away, walked toward the table, where the pen lay beside the maintenance file. He looked at the signatures already there, the neat stamps representing hundreds of safe decisions in the past. He knew that with one more signature, everything could fall back into regulation, and he knew that if he did, there might be no one left to save. Ellison Ellison stayed still, neither stopping him nor urging him. His position had been made clear. The rest was no longer his. Everyone else held their breath, as if even the smallest noise could decide countless lives. Reynolds placed his hand on the pen. In that moment, he remembered every hard decision he had made before, always believing the system protected both the decision-maker and the people impacted by the decision. But this time, the system was silent, and outside, the water was still rising. He didn't pick up the pen. Reynolds pushed it aside firmly, but without force. "Continue the test." His voice was low, not loud, but clear enough that no one could pretend they heard wrong. No one cheered. No one objected further. The room didn't explode, it sank, heavier than before. Everyone understood that. From this second onward, they had stepped across a line that couldn't be taken back. Keller nodded, saying nothing. He turned and walked toward the Apache, its rain-soaked fuselage glowing under the lights. Ellison watched him go, his hand tight around the notebook, but he didn't write another word. Reynolds stayed behind, eyes on both men, feeling the full weight of the decision he had just made. Outside, wind and water merged into one relentless sound, a reminder that time was no longer on their side. And, in the hangar, the Apache prepared for its second attempt, carrying a hope so thin, no one dared call it by name. The hangar felt louder only because it had been silent for too long. Everyone moved urgently, but no one made small talk or tossed out the pointless comments they usually did. They all understood they were standing in their exact positions, not because of protocol, but because one careless motion could turn the danger back onto them. Keller stepped up the small ladder into the auxiliary control seat, the overhead lights casting sharp reflections across his cheekbones, revealing the deep lines carved by time and by flights no one wanted to revisit. Reynolds stood a few meters away, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze trying to remain steady even as tension pulled tighter. With every second he stared out the hangar door, where the wind was slamming sheets of snow across the white runway. Ellison kept his distance farther back, arms folded, not approaching the Apache but not taking his eyes off it either. When Keller signaled readiness, the lead technician drew in a deep breath and lifted his hand to the start switch. No one told anyone to back up, yet they all stepped a half-pace away out of instinct. As if that small distance might save them from the explosion they were all trying very hard not to imagine. The switch was pressed, the ignition whine echoed, and the whole Apache jerked once, as if waking from a sleep far too long. The engine vibrated hard, its first note, dry and harsh, causing several technicians nearby to freeze mid-movement. But instead of dropping out like before, the vibration stretched another half-second, then shifted lower, steadier, like something feeling for its own rhythm, one beat at a time. A technician whispered, unable to stop himself, "It's finding the pulse again." Keller didn't look at anyone. His hand slid lightly across the control panel, checking each metric, stopping at the RPM gauge. "Hold the RPM," he said, voice steady. "Don't touch anything else." His face didn't show relief, nor suspicion. It looked like someone listening to something else entirely, a heartbeat made of metal and pressure. Deep inside the helicopter, the gears of the transmission began working through their cycles. A faint whine rose, like machinery that had been forgotten for too long, and now had to remind itself how to move. A technician beside Keller clenched both hands and murmured, "If it slips RPM again, the compressor will burn." The words weren't a warning, they were a bare fact. Outside, the wind slammed the steel door hard enough to make everyone imagine the force they'd soon be fighting once the Apache lifted off. Snow swept sideways, scattering against the fuselage, turning reflected light into shifting white blurs. The rotor blades began pulling air in, accelerating, carving a vortex that ripped across the runway. Snow on the ground lifted and spiraled around the Apache in a dense white halo. Even from far back, everyone felt the pressure of the expanding airflow, a sign the engine was entering a more stable phase, though not yet safe enough for anyone to exhale. Ellison stayed with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the Apache. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for those nearby. "Running doesn't mean flying." It wasn't another protest, just a reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe. A few technicians glanced at him, their expressions a mix of tension and hope. They knew he was right, but they also knew they couldn't stop here. Inside the cockpit, Keller adjusted his seat slightly, leaning toward the fluctuating readings on the control panel. The screens cast a sharp, cold light across his face. He touched the throttle not to increase or decrease it, but to feel the vibration beneath. Years of testing engines had carved a reflex into him that no one else possessed. He could hear how an engine breathed under strain. This time was the same. He listened for the smallest tremor in the structure thrumming beneath his hands. A small click sounded from the gearbox, followed by a thin, metallic scrape, like metal brushing metal at a distance. A technician immediately shot a look at Keller. Keller nodded almost imperceptibly, as if the sound matched something he had expected. A few people didn't dare look away from the Apache's tail. They knew a single violent shudder could twist the helicopter, crack the shaft, or snap the rotor blades, ending the rescue before it even began. Keller said, "Stabilize RPM at 30%. Don't let it rise until we've aligned with the wind." A technician answered quickly, holding steady. Another scanned the lower electrical panel, eyes tense. No new warnings, at least not yet, but no one in the hangar believed that entirely. Every person was stretched tight like a drawn wire. A heavy gust hit the sidewall, vibrating the entire hangar in one jolt. Tools hanging on the wall rattled sharply. The rotor blades widened their vortex, pulling long sheets of snow across the runway and sweeping them left. For a moment, the scene looked exactly like a whiteout takeoff where every horizon is erased. Reynolds stepped half a pace forward, standing at the hangar entrance, but not past the safety line. His eyes locked onto the control panel in front of Keller, searching for the stability he needed before calling the rescue team. He knew that if the Apache was ready, they would have to lift off immediately. There would be no seconds left for rechecking anything. The pressure squeezed around his chest like a metal band, tightening until even his breathing felt slower. Through the wind thrashing outside, someone whispered, "If it makes it past this stage, it has a chance to fly." Another replied, "A chance is enough." Keller stayed silent, focused on the steadying engine pulse, trying to hold itself together beneath the helicopter. He knew the most critical moment hadn't arrived yet. Everything so far was only the beginning. The Apache hadn't truly told him whether it was ready. He waited for a sign, any sign from the machine itself, not an electronic signal, a vibration, a shift in tone, something only long years of flying had trained him to notice. Then it appeared. The RPM needle trembled once, just once, a single quiver, as if nudged by wind, then it settled. Everyone turned toward the display, holding their breath, waiting for it to drift. But it didn't. It steadied after that twitch, lining up along the trend Keller needed. He placed a hand on the panel, narrowing his eyes in full concentration. 1 second, 2, 3. Then, Keller spoke deep, clear, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through everything. "Prepare for takeoff." The Apache lifted off the ground with a heavy, decisive motion, as if the helicopter had to tear itself free from the storm's grip. Keller kept his hand on the cyclic from the first second, not letting the co-pilot touch anything until he felt the engine fall into rhythm. Wind slammed sideways into the fuselage like an invisible collision, tilting the Apache nearly 12 degrees. The co-pilot jerked upright, grabbed the edge of the console, lay and shouted, "Correcting, correcting." But Keller had already corrected before the second word left his mouth. He rotated his wrist and brought the cyclic into the exact angle that matched the wind spilling down the slope, leveling the helicopter in a single beat. Keller glanced out the front canopy. Snow grew thicker as they left the hangar behind. Large white sheets torn into strands by the wind and thrown hard against the fuselage. Vortices shoved the Apache up and down as if testing its limits. At low altitude, the engine's echo inside the cockpit felt heavier, rougher, each vibration making the crew instinctively check the pressure gauge. Below, the ground was covered in mud and rock, broken into dark patches that gave no hint of depth. The co-pilot checked the numbers again. Fuel was burning faster than expected. He muttered, "We're burning fuel like we're flying two birds." Keller didn't answer. He leaned forward to watch the valley coming into view. It appeared like the mouth of a giant well, deep, white, and without an exit. Wind poured down from both slopes, colliding at the center, creating sudden air pockets that could slam the Apache sideways into the cliffs if the pilot wasn't steady enough. A violent gust blasted from left to right, then curled downward like it was sucked into the pit. The Apache dropped sharply, the nose pulling down as if gravity had doubled. Alerts blared high, urgent, indistinguishable from the wind or the systems themselves. Terrain, terrain. The co-pilot squeezed his side stick on instinct, but Keller held the main controls with near absolute force. He dropped the cyclic lower, stabilizing the helicopter closer to the ground, then protocol allowed. A bold choice off by a few centimeters. The Apache would drill into rock. "Stay under the wind band. Trust me," Keller said, voice low, quiet but impossible to ignore. The co-pilot looked at him for half a second, then lifted his hands off the controls. The low wind layer was where no one wanted to fly, but in this storm, it was the only place the Apache could dodge. the unpredictable vortex coming from the valley's throat. Keller slipped the helicopter inches above the mud and debris, low enough that the rotor wash carved small spirals across the shallow pools below. Every movement was calculated, keeping the Apache out of the turbulent zone above but away from the suction zone near the ground. About 3 minutes after they entered the valley, faint flashes from the rescue team's flashlights flickered below them. A voice from behind, Keller said, "They're calling. They see us." And they had 3 people stood in the middle of the mud flow, clinging to anchored ropes behind boulders that had barely held through the first landslide. Their flashlights blinked rapidly, like they were trying to pull the Apache down with light alone. Keller dropped lower, fighting to keep the tail from swinging while the wind shifted every few seconds. At this altitude, a falling slab of mud could knock the helicopter out of balance. And it happened. A deep roar came from above, followed by a massive sheet of mud and debris ripping off the slope. It crashed down less than 2 meters from the rotor blades, dragging rocks and soaked timber along with it. The co-pilot cursed, gripping his harness tight, while Keller instantly backed the Apache away just enough to protect the rotor arc. The technicians back in the hangar had said the Apache wasn't built for rescue. They were right. In this situation, every second Keller kept it in the air, went against everything the helicopter had been designed for, but he pressed it back into the proper approach line, angling the nose toward the rescue team like a guiding beacon. Snow streaked sideways across the canopy, whitening out the view again. The vortices pushed the Apache right, then the updraft from the valley floor yanked it back left. The co-pilot kept scanning the screens, his expression shifting each time a metric hit the yellow line. He tried to keep his voice level, but urgency leaked through. "We can't hold this rhythm long. The valley floor winds shift every 18 seconds. "I know," Keller said, eyes locked on a small patch of visibility in the fogged glass. "Focus. Don't miss a single movement." In the dim light from the rescue team, he had already picked out the most stable spot if they had to bring more people up. Keller lowered the helicopter a few more feet. Mud and rock fragments pattered against the belly window with a heavy, wet sound. The co-pilot tilted his head to confirm nothing was bouncing toward the rotor blades. He exhaled sharply. "If we collapse at this height, no chance to climb again." But Keller held the line. The group below began moving toward the Apache's light, following a narrow strip of ground the wind hadn't buried yet. They stepped carefully, one step at a time, because a slip would send them into the soft mud where others had vanished earlier. Keller tilted the helicopter just enough to keep the rotor wash off the rescue team, minimizing risk. In that brief moment, none of them were thinking about how the Apache engine had barely started, or about the man the hangar had forgotten for years, who was now the only thing keeping these people alive. Everything came down to wind rhythm, altitude, stability, and Keller's hands. A larger vortex slammed into the tail, shifting it sharply left. The co-pilot shouted, "Left side." Keller countered instantly, forcing the weight back to center. Every muscle in his arms tensed through the movement, his reflexes working right at the edge of life and death. The tension stretched tighter and tighter until a sharp crack erupted not from the wind, not from the engine, but from upstream. A cold, splitting sound tore through the valley, echoing off the cliffs as if amplified. At the same moment, the radio burst alive through static. "The dam is opening." The sound tore the air, and their future with it. The sharp cracking sound upstream hadn't even faded when a mass of black water burst through the split in the dam, hitting the valley like a direct blow. It rushed downward far too fast, dragging mud, rocks, and large broken pieces of timber with it, turning into a chaotic torrent racing straight toward the rescue team. The radio lit up instantly amid static, and a voice breaking from strain. "Run, run now." The people below turned at once, stumbling in the mud and debris but still forcing themselves forward under the slice of light the Apache was throwing down. As the first surge swept across the valley floor, a vortex slammed hard into the helicopter's side, shaking the Apache violently. The engine, already pushed to its limit, turned rough, heavy, and uneven. The co-pilot clutched his harness, feeling every jolt travel up through the seat. A harsh, sideways hit sent the aircraft lurching left, and then, exactly what they feared, a left-side cabin door blew loose, under repeated blasts of crosswind. It snapped open halfway, swinging dangerously close to the rotor arc. The co-pilot lunged across the cockpit to grab it, both hands locking around the edge, teeth clenched as he shouted. "I can't hold it for long." Keller flicked him a half-second glance, noting the strain in the man's hands, but he turned back immediately to the controls. No distraction. Not now. The water was coming too fast. The team below had only seconds left before the rising mud swallowed the path. Keller kept the Apache dangerously low, only a few meters off the ground, close enough that the mud burst upward in long streaks. He shouted into the radio, voice compressed inside the chaos. "Move under me, don't lose the light below." The rescue team used their small flashlights to orient themselves. The cold beam from the Apache cut across the ground, revealing new cracks forming along the escape route. Earth collapsed in chunks, water rising with a brutal snap, and just as they were running, the radio burst again in panic. "We've still got 3 people. The dam just ripped open." Keller tightened his grip on the controls. 3 people. Only 3. He lowered the Apache even more, holding the helicopter steady inside the storm's chaos, while the wind kept trying to swallow it whole. The co-pilot beside him was being hit by gusts over and over, his hands going numb from holding the door, wrists shaking with each violent shove, but he kept holding on, because if the door tore free, the pressure inside the cabin would shift, and the Apache could lose balance in a single instant. The water from upstream rolled downward so fast that the landscape in front of the Apache changed every second. Mud and rocks filled the low ground, dragging wood, metal, and the remains of houses from higher up. A few power lines fell, splashing into the black water and sending sparks that vanished under the wind. Through the roar of wind and water, a scene flickered across Keller's mind. Not this valley. Years ago, a collapsing roof in murky rain, swallowed by mud in seconds. A voice inside the house, cut off mid-scream as the water took everything. He had arrived minutes too late. He never forgot, and that memory made him grip the controls harder, flying the Apache into a sharp curve to close the distance to the last group, still not clear of the slope. The co-pilot turned toward him, sweat streaking down his temple. "Keller, if we drop any lower, cut the wind readout." Keller cut in. "I know where I'm putting it." Up close, Keller saw the 3 people pinned behind a large boulder, where mud was falling faster than anywhere else. One had fallen, his foot trapped under a chunk of rotted wood. The other 2 pulled at him, but the mud was already at their ankles. Keller angled the Apache slightly right, reducing direct rotor wash so they wouldn't be blown off their feet. The bright path ahead of the helicopter formed the only corridor they could run through without falling into a new vortex forming behind them. At last, they broke free of the soft ground, climbing to higher terrain. As the final person stepped into the safe zone, Keller was about to lift the Apache a little higher when the control panel flashed red. A sharp, dry alarm sliced through the wind, an oil pressure warning. The indicator blinked rapidly, the message clear. Oil pressure critical. The co-pilot jerked back as if ripped from a trance. "This is bad. If it drops any more, the compressor will lock." His voice cracked between the metal rattling around them. Secondary systems began flashing too. Some lines were chilled and unstable from the cold air. Keller stared at the panel. His eyes didn't twitch or show panic. Everything inside him drew into a single line of focus. He raised the Apache a few meters to avoid the surge beneath them, but the oil pressure kept falling one notch, then another. The co-pilot tried to shove the door closed again, but another blast tore it outward, throwing him off balance and smashing his shin against the frame. He shouted, "It's going to tear off the hinge." Outside, the valley was collapsing in sections. New cracks ran across the cliffs, and sheets of mud fell like smaller waterfalls. The Apache still had to stay low to guide the team, but every second in this position tortured the engine further. Keller felt each vibration growing heavier, a specific kind of vibration, one any veteran pilot recognized the signature of a compressor on the verge of cutting out. The radio came alive again, this time from the team who had reached safety. "We're all up, Apache. Do you copy? You're clear to pull out." But their voices were drowned out by the alarms. Oil pressure hit its deepest red, the needle shaking like it was ready to snap. The co-pilot shouted now, "All control gone. We have to turn back now. If we don't, the engine will die in the valley." His voice blended with the wind, the water, the shaking metal of the Apache hanging in the cockpit like a blade about to fall. The Apache dragged itself through the last stretch of wind before touching the runway, the airframe shuddering as if it had exhausted every ounce of strength after being pushed past its limits for too long. Keller held the cyclic steady until the final second, refusing to loosen his grip even slightly, making sure the helicopter didn't drift as the landing gear met the thin layer of frozen concrete. Remnant gusts slapped along the fuselage, metal knocking in small, irregular claps, then everything suddenly sank into stillness as the Apache dropped straight onto the ground, and the moment the wheels touched, the engine shut off in a single abrupt gasp, with no cooldown phase, as if the helicopter had run on its last breath. and finally had to surrender its own weight to the earth. The moment froze the entire runway. No one approached in the first few seconds, even though, by procedure, the maintenance team should have rushed in immediately to check residual heat and pressure, but no one moved. Silence settled over them like a thick shell, heavier and harder to breathe through than the wind outside. The nearest technician took half a step and stopped, glancing at the temperature reader blinking on his handheld tool, frowning, then muttering low enough for only one person beside him to hear. If it had died 2 minutes earlier, we wouldn't be standing here. The others heard it but didn't respond. They didn't dare look at each other, didn't dare look at the Apache, and didn't dare look at Keller. The air thickened, not from the cold, but because everyone knew they had just witnessed something outside their training, outside their procedures, outside the limits they once believed were absolute. Keller removed his flight helmet, the motion slow but steady. He set it on the Apache's fuselage, right near the seam between the body and the rotor mast, the spot that was always the hottest after every flight. Today, the metal was ice cold. The brief, firm touch carried no hint of triumph, no gesture of gratitude. It felt like placing an old burden back on the machine that had just crossed a razor-thin line with him. Not far away, Ellison stood at the end of the runway. His hand still gripped the notebook that had never left his side. But at the end of this flight, he didn't open it, didn't write a single new line. The page remained blank, untouched. He watched the Apache for a long moment, with an expression tangled in something hard to name: regret, confusion, or simply fear of confronting the truth that everything he had predicted was no longer the ground he could rely on. A mid-ranking officer beside him tilted his head toward his colleague, speaking low so no one else could hear. Saving lives doesn't mean it was a proper flight. The remark wasn't meant to attack Keller, more like an attempt to reassure himself that the system he followed still held value. But his voice betrayed uncertainty. He knew better than anyone that tonight the Apache had flown on something no manual had ever accounted for. No one asked how the flight had gone. No congratulations. No cheers from people who had escaped disaster. No hand on the shoulder acknowledging survival. The onlookers avoided each other's eyes, as if meeting Keller's gaze, or looking directly at the Apache, would force them to admit that the standards they trusted no longer stood firm. Reynolds walked forward slowly, boots sinking into the thin layer of snow. He stopped at the helicopter's nose, examining the streaks of mud still clinging to the metal skin. The white runway lights hardened his face until it looked carved from iron. He didn't look at Keller right away. He looked at the Apache first, scanning for cracks, bolts, the tail still trembling with leftover stress. Only once he was certain it wouldn't collapse again did he turn to Keller. "You, briefing room, now." Reynolds didn't raise his voice, not colder, not softer, but the sentence alone made several nearby personnel drop their eyes as if afraid his stare might turn on them next. Keller nodded, asking no why. He stepped away from the Apache using the left side deck. The co-pilot was still bracing the half-loosened door, while technicians worked around him. As Keller passed, the co-pilot only looked up for a brief instant, saying nothing. Not from lack of words, he simply realized Keller had done something no pilot on the team could say. With certainty they would have survived, attempting. Reynolds walked beside Keller, neither led nor followed. Their steps were heavy but without urgency. They said nothing as they crossed into the operations building. As they passed down the hallway, a few soldiers stepped aside. No one greeted them. No one dared ask what came next. Through the long hallway, Keller kept his stride straight, neither lowering his head nor glancing around. He knew this wasn't the ending. It was merely the shift from the violence of the storm outside to the quieter, subtler kind of turbulence that could wear a person down if they weren't steady. Reynolds walked alongside him, each step adding weight, not from anger, but from the knowledge that he was about to confront a truth no one wanted to see. The briefing room door opened, the hinges scraping with a sound cold as steel dragging across steel. The warm light inside was hardly warmer than the air outside. Reynolds pushed the door wider so Keller could enter first. The room was empty, no inspector, no technicians, no officers summoned, only a long table in the center, and, on the table, arranged neatly, perfectly aligned, sorted in tidy stacks were the entire maintenance records of the Apache, not a page out of place, not a crooked folder, not for display, but as if they had been waiting there all along. The briefing room, once quiet, suddenly became a place where every sound was swallowed whole. No footsteps, no hallway ventilation, just the turning of pages under hands too familiar with peeling apart misconduct. The inspector stood at the head of the table, back straight, eyes fixed on no one. In front of him lay stacks of files sorted into 3 groups by year, quarter, and maintenance cycle. Keller stood a few steps away, Silent, Reynolds stood to the right, hands clasped behind his back, holding steady focus, while Ellison sat near the end of the table, both hands resting on the notebook he hadn't closed since entering. The inspector opened the file, his voice, even and cold. "We're not reviewing the flight. We're reviewing what has been signed over the last 3 years." No one blinked. The room sank into a silence like the moments before a surgery everyone knew would not be gentle. The projector lit up, displaying maintenance reports one by one. The first line looked normal, like any other report, but by the next page, and the next, repetition emerged. Dates changed, but the content repeated nearly word for word. A senior technician in the corner, summoned to assist the audit, pointed to a specific entry. "This compression chamber can't be cleaned 3 months in a row. Not unless it was never opened." His voice didn't shake, yet sounded like someone long accustomed to witnessing wrongs he couldn't intervene in. Page after page turned. Each turn echoed like a knife stroke through everyone's chest. Then the inspector stopped. He angled the file so the room could see. The same signature, the same handwriting, all of them belonged to Mark Ellison. The room stayed dead and still. Ellison opened his mouth to say something, but the moment he began, no one asked, no one answered, no one looked at him. His explanation drifted, weightless, as if it had lost its validity before even being spoken. The inspector continued, "This is why the engine went silent. Not broken, buried." The statement landed directly at the core. No further analysis was needed. The hangar, the technical teams, and the entire base had been spinning on the illusion of legitimate paperwork. Everyone stayed frozen, as though any movement might make the room explode. Reynolds stepped closer, pulling a bundle of maintenance invoices clipped at the back of the file. He set them in front of Ellison, his voice still controlled but leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Where did this budget go?" Red numbers, senseless cuts, unclear expenses stretched like a roadmap pointing straight to an anomaly. The silence lingered long past politeness, no longer respectful or cautious, but a space in which everyone understood only one person could speak next. Ellison didn't look at Reynolds, nor Keller. He stared at the files before him, at the pages he had signed again and again for 3 years with a confidence hard to justify. At last, Ellison spoke, barely audible, barely enough breath to cross the table. "I just wanted everything, not to cause trouble." Reynolds answered instantly, not louder, not softer. "You create trouble by hiding it." No one added to it. No accusations, no defense. Reynolds's words needed no supporters. They were the unavoidable conclusion of what lay exposed before them. A junior officer entered, placing a suspension order in front of Ellison. No one read it aloud. No one explained its contents. It sat there like a heavy period at the end of the chain of actions Ellison had tried to defend under the banner of procedure. He lowered his eyes to the bold print at the top, closing them slightly as he signed. No condolences were offered, no encouragement, no expressions of satisfaction. Everything felt strangely weightless, as though exhaustion had drained everyone of reaction. The meeting ended with no bell, no whistle, no signal. The inspector collected the files, and the junior officer escorted Ellison out. No one watched him go. Reynolds pushed his chair in, grabbed his coat from the rack, and left first with heavy but steady steps. Keller lingered a few seconds, looking down at the space where the stack of files had been. He understood the meeting wasn't about him, nor about the flight. It was about the truth no one had dared touch for too long. Keller stepped into the hallway, the cold air hitting him but not as sharply as the emptiness settling in his chest. He walked straight to the hangar, out of instinct because he still believed that if anything unfinished remained, it would always be where he had left the Apache. Reynolds arrived a few minutes later, moving faster than usual. He searched the machinery area, then glanced toward the corner where Keller had placed his old tool bag upon arrival. It was gone. The tool bag had vanished. Reynolds stopped, exhaling a long breath. Not disappointment, something closer to a strange relief. When he turned, his gaze swept across the runway outside. The Apache sat in the snow-streaked mud, no wind whistling through its rotor gaps, no residual frame, shutter. The entire airframe had been opened, the rotor secured, engine bay spread wide to reveal every joint, wire, bolt, and coupling. Each component was placed in perfect order on the stands, as if someone were preparing to start an inspection from zero. For the first time in years, nothing was hidden, and the Apache, silent as it was, looked as though it was waiting for one person. But Keller had left the base before anyone noticed. The story of the AH-64 Apache isn't just a tense rescue situation or a clash between experience and procedure. It exposes a larger lesson about how people face responsibility. When a system runs on paperwork and habit, safety can be be replaced by the feeling that everything is fine. Danger doesn't always come from loud mistakes. It often builds from small things we ignore, repeated signatures, and silence born from fear of causing trouble. This story reminds us that procedures are created to protect people, but when procedures turn into shields to avoid responsibility, they backfire. Sometimes the real value lies in facing the problem directly, even when it makes us uncomfortable or forces us to pay a price. Experience, professional conscience, and honesty cannot be replaced by any form or template. Ask yourself in work and in life, how many times have we stayed silent just to avoid stirring things up? If this story made you think, share it so more people can learn from it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep following more grounded, honest, and meaningful stories in the future.